today I am going to be talking a little bit about the academic side of poetry and poetics, because that's my background. It's very academic in terms of English literature, and then I'll actually get to showing you some poems, and I've included pictures of the authors I'm talking about so you can have names and poems put to faces, and I think it's just very important to see images of authors, not just trans authors, but authors in general. I always like knowing what the people look like when I read their literature. So yeah, it's going to be fairly formal, but if anyone honestly has any questions during, just let me know. That's totally fine. I was a TA for a period, so I'm used to people putting up their hands and asking. So yeah, I'll get started. So I'm here today to talk about my research regarding poetry and transgender writers, trans poetics, and to share poems written by several authors based in Canada and the United States. So I want to frame my discussion and research not around a definition of trans poetics, but rather around an invitation, one that involves having readers of trans poetry listen to the poets themselves. So frankly, part of my reasoning for letting the poems and the poets do much of the work for me, so to speak, comes from a mistrust of cisgender academics who have not really treated the work of trans people with the respect it deserves, or like not even addressed it at all. And that was a recurring issue I came across in my a lot of my studies, was where are the trans people talking about trans poetry? So academic analysis of literature in general is deeply rooted in colonial, heterosexual, patriarchal systems that I unfortunately cannot be claimed to be entirely removed from, but I'm actually doing my best to combat these dominant modes of thought. So until the system changes, however, I, like many others, must conduct my research within spaces such as these and confront challenges when they present themselves. So this action of confronting, or perhaps more accurately addressing, is part of why I choose to resist seeking a definition for trans poetry outside of simply knowing it is poetry written by a trans person. But definitions can often help in garnering understanding and of expanding beyond that definition. So it is still necessary for me to address the ongoing discussion of defining trans poetics, which has been a continued kind of subject amongst trans writers. So many of the theorists that I'll be talking about today are poets themselves and are linked to creative writing as well as academic writing in incredibly personal ways. I quote them liberally in order to have a more accurate understanding of how trans people write, how they think about their own writing, and how they, in many cases, want their writing to be perceived. It is far too easy to impose one's own ideas onto a poem when reading it, and it is imperative that we address trans people's writing by looking also to their own thoughts on writing itself. So these primary sources are invaluable to a student such as myself, who seeks to understand and expand the current library of writing on trans literature and literary expression. So I want to enter into this subject with care, appreciation, attention to detail, and with listening skills that will allow me to attend to the work of trans writers in this space with love and understanding. I'm a big sap. I hope you can join me in this effort too. Let's go to the next slide here. Yeah. So this is a quote from Joy Layden, who I'll be talking about quite a lot today. And I learned that Erin is a good friend of hers, so that was very exciting. But first, I want to bring up Troubling the Line, which is the title of an anthology that was published in 2013. It was Troubling the Line, Trans and Genderqueer Poetry and Poetics. So it was one of the very first, I think if not the first, anthologies of just trans literature, especially poetry, to be published in North America. So editor T.C. Tolbert states that the cultural work of this anthology is in part a quote, attempt to expand the range of what is possible for trans and genderqueer poets, and to acknowledge that there is no such thing as monolithic trans and genderqueer poetry. Tolbert further notes that there are two dangers to producing an anthology that will undoubtedly shift literary culture. They are exclusion and isolation or confinement. Tolbert and fellow editor Trace Peterson are both aware that, as a burgeoning field of study and literary culture, transgender poetry and poetics simply cannot be defined, lest they perpetuate exclusion. So likewise, in 2014, Trace Peterson wrote what was, at the time, the first paper to be published in a peer-reviewed journal that was explicitly about trans poetics and poetry by trans people. It was also allegedly the first scholarly article written with the attempt to define, at the very least, a few standard aspects of trans poetry. So in this attempt, Peterson looked at 3 trans writers, all based in the United States and writing from the 70s and 80s, and they were Samuel Ace, Maxwell Filario, and Kari Edwards. She found that they shared common ground stylistically by avoiding direct references to trans experience, by fragmenting their work, and by, quote, destabilizing or sabotaging an idealized sense of self in the articulation of that self. She also referenced quite literally the intelligibility, whatever you might understand that to be, in their poetry, and their insistent use of narration, despite the fragmentation that was also going on. So like Tolbert, in her own introduction to the anthology, Troubling the Line, Peterson states that trans poets often face a unique form of isolation. There's this recurring discussion of isolation. And she states that the aporia of isolation consists of a basic inability to articulate or make visible the position that one occupies in publicly, socially, or politically understandable language. So trans poets then are always working to write against that sense of isolation that comes from this language, this lack of language rather, and that's where a lot of my research lies, is what gaps are being filled in regards to this lack of language. So trans poets are doing this work because no one else will or can do it. The work I'm referring to is often the work of, again, writing against isolation, toward occupying space, and towards self-preservation through self-expression. The focus of trans writing, in particular, again, poetry and poetics, is, in my eyes, drawn from my own experience as a trans writer and a work of personal continuance. So I'm also a poet myself, so my research is, it's a very personal thing for me as well. I'm really interested in the development of trans poetics as a poet and as an academic. So much of trans poetry and poetics focuses on lived experience, personal anecdotes, and self-reflection. Much more of the work is undertaken to understand a personal past, grapple with the continual present, and imagine a future wherein the trans writer's existence reaches some desired state of being and being in the world. It is work that aims to, often quite literally, fill in the blanks. In her essay, I Am Not Me, Unmaking and Remaking the Language of Self, Joy Layden again states that, quote, the problem of gender identity goes way beyond a lack of nouns. The blank in language where words for our gender identity should be reflect deeper blanks in culture. These blanks, Layden continues, make it difficult to locate the self, and she claims that, quote, when it comes to this aspect of transgender experience, poetry, not fiction, is the natural medium. I argue that the most important part of this incredibly necessary observation is the following, which is the quote I have up here, in which she addresses language's role in trans poetics. So this work about the self in poetry is neither selfish nor selfless. Rather, the work of trans writers in both creating and preserving the self is essentially tied in part to their poetics. So American poet Carl Phillips addresses the politics of simply being in his essay, The Politics of Mere Being. He talks about how that is one way then to queer language, just by writing, deliberately and for the purpose of tailoring it to one's own purposes. The other is less intentional and is the one I myself more relate to. I make sentences not to argue for outsiderness, but as the only space in which my outsiderness makes sense to me. From the start, I've thought of writing as a near physical wrestling with all but unpin-downable concerns. So drawing from Layden's observation about a trans poetic that needs to recognize both content and structure as trans, alongside Phillips' idea of intentional versus unintentional queering of language, trans poetics, I argue, grapple with language in all of these ways and then some. It's a very broad area that I'm looking at. But in many cases, language is trans rather than queered, and I want to make that difference going ahead here and in my future studies. In the case of American poet Joss Charles, for example, she, quote, explains her work as an effort to break free of the constraints of existing words, much as transgender people try to break free of the narrow definition of gender. In many cases, however, trans poets write in order to understand aspects of themselves rather than to, again, to break free of a sense of understanding. This is the, quote, near physical wrestling with all but unpindownable concerns that Phillips mentions. These aspects of the self and one's life are incredibly difficult to put into words. But these are difficulties that trans writers are, again, faced with daily and are intimately familiar with. Poetry's fluidity and flexibility means it remains a space wherein trans authors can not only wrestle, but embrace, or at the very least begin to touch upon, these concerns that have been nearly impossible to discuss due to a language and literature designed to serve mostly cisgender or non-trans writers. It comes as no surprise then that my own difficulty in accessing scholarly writing by trans people on poetry was immense. It was very, very tough. I'm so thankful for the people I did find, but yeah. So instead of focusing mostly on academic writing, I utilize reviews, interviews, statements, and other ephemera of trans-identified poets, academics, students, and members of the community in order to garner a more accurate and more appropriate representation of trans poetics than I ever could from the works of cis theorists and academics. A big portion of my work as well also investigates how it can be posited that there is a lack of vocabulary available in the English language that adequately or accurately describes trans experience. Trans poetics, then, are effectively always working against and around conventional binary descriptions of bodies, genders, sexes, and related experiences in order to both enact and represent their identities and poetics largely built to support the idea of the identities of, again, cisgender writers. And I have another quote from Latin, and there she is there. I guess two quotes, yeah, that's a portion of a quote, and then the longer one. She mentions, again, this problem, the lack of words, signs, and conventions that really stuck out to me in almost a glaring way as I was reading a lot of poetic statements from people. Like everyone that I read, or most everyone that I read, was really concerned with how they can write about themselves in a vocabulary that has no space for them. So the idea of expressing the self is Layton's main point. She approaches trans poetics as, quote, a set of questions dealing with the dynamic relations between experiences of embodiment, creation, writing, and conceptualization. Not just of the poetry, but also of the trans author of said poetry. Trans poetics are a practice of becoming that Layton states is most easily recognizable in first-person poems. Poems that, quote, cannot help but highlight the provisional, evolving nature of the self, the way ourselves, even the most normative selves, change a little every time we look or speak of them. This, quote-unquote, becoming, however, can and often does go beyond the individual self-exploratory art of the personal lyric poem. Layton continues claiming that, quote, since human identity is a process of signification, trans poetics can be a process of not only making poetry, but of making trans identities and experiences intelligible and thus viable in a world beyond the margins. This is all to say that by expressing the trans person's self through poetry, these trans authors alter modes of becoming through signification, allowing for new modes of being to emerge. But the self can be expressed, again, in a myriad of ways. So something else that I'm interested in is what kind of images, metaphors, myths, personal myths, lyrics, and even exact uses of language am I encountering in the poetry that I'm reading. And I aim to go beyond this aesthetic kind of look as well, especially in regards to process and understanding of transcontinuous and self-expression and self-preservation as expressed in the poetry. So the words themselves in these works go much deeper than aesthetic enterprise. They are an effort of someone's existence. Some more quotes from, as you can see, I really love Layton's work, as well as Carl Phillips, who is, again, an amazing poet. So though I argue in keeping with Layton that while the enterprise of trans poetics is assuredly and rightly fixated in addressing the language-based problem of lacking vocabulary, I must also recognize that the writing itself is focused on filling the gaps in all forms of expression related to being trans and writing as a trans poet. Expression that goes beyond the self and into ways of seeing and being in the world. So one must develop language and adjust language in order to express oneself fully and completely. And again, Leighton writes that, quote, trans poetics is defined by its ends, the creation of language, for modes of self and being for which there is no language, rather than by the poetic means used to achieve those ends. So yeah, her understanding of trans poetics is very interesting and very steeped in looking at the language itself. Whereas for me, I'm trying to grapple with whether I want to look just at the language itself, or I want to look at like a trans poet's whole expression of their being. Because many of them, as you'll see when we get to the poems, many of them are not just poets, but they're also performers, they're also visual artists, they're also academics. So how can all of this come into their poetic expression, so to speak? So as language explicitly or implicitly reflects the current political climate in which its author lives, the ends here, the creation of language where there is no language available, is an intensely political act, and that unfortunately cannot really be avoided. Returning to Carl Phillips, he states, quote, to each their own urgency. How is it not political to be simply living one's life meaningfully, thoughtfully, which means variously in keeping with, in counterpoint to, and resistance to life's many parts? To insist on being who we are is a political act. From this we can glean, again, that the poetry of trans people is inevitably deemed political, despite potentially the author's intention, due to what it is doing, insisting upon a creation of language and an identity aided by that language that has, again, been denied for the most part. So I've got one more quote from Leighton to kind of round out this discussion of the theory here. Where again, she's talking about not just liberation from convention of identity, but again, deconstructing and rebuilding aspects of identity and understanding of identity through language and through poetic language in particular. So the greater trans poetic project that she references here implies a kind of universal benefit from developing new ways to express and understand our own identities. Everyone, regardless of gender identity, would find their truths and be able to express themselves with a vocabulary that suited their needs. Leighton seems to believe that trans poetics has the ability to drastically alter the ways in which the English language is currently used for the betterment of personal identity and identification. So yeah, here's kind of a sum up of what I've just talked about. But I too believe in this possibility. Trans poets and their trans poetics are working towards securing language not only for their current selves, but their future selves as well. By working against conventional and binary modes of self-expression created by and for cisgender people, trans poets in writing upset cultural, social, and political notions of trans people by transing language. That is, prioritizing trans experiences in spaces where the language would otherwise and normally focus on non-trans experiences. So again, transing poetics challenges a dominant poetic that prioritizes cisgender bodies, and by extension, cisgender experiences, by bringing to poetic language underrepresented or unforeseen inactions of trans livelihood. And these are some more quotes from T.C. Tollard on the top there and Tracy Peterson on the bottom. And again, if anyone is interested in looking at this anthology, I believe there is a copy in the archives. It's amazing. It's over like 400 pages of trans poetry and poetics and personal statements from the authors as well. I believe they only have one Canadian in there, but that's okay. So it's also important to note that that trans poetics and transing language can go beyond strictly writing. In her essay, Transing Disability Poetics at the Confluence, Petra Kuppers explores how she finds transing of language an expression of disability cultures, indigeneity, and transgender experiences that are not strictly related to the written word. The poetics of these socio-political identifiers inform the works of poets like Eli Clare and Margaret Newton, who Kuppers quotes in discussion with her own personal experiences and the work of theorists. She concludes that the act and art of transing language is, quote, playing in the uncertainty of withheld intelligibility. None of us make sense to dominant logics, such as the trans man, the woman who can't make herself heard on the phone, the fat chair user, or the indigenous person who asserts difference and connection beyond cultural stereotypes. And again, this is what the anthology looks like. And this is Petra covers. So for those who do not make sense to dominant logics, of, for example, cisgender, able-bodied, and heterosexual existence and poetic language, again, transing of poetic expression, wherever it may be found, allows for connection among those who might otherwise be disconnected due to oppressive power structures. The transing of language, then, argues Cuppers, can allow marginalized peoples to live in a, quote, multilingual, multi-bodied, and multi-sounding world, and honor the material spaces that support their lives. Yeah, she's an amazing performance artist, so a lot of her work has to do with like space and taking up space and enacting through spaces. This aim to trans language, though quickly gaining traction as trans writers seek to expand their work and amplify their voices, is still, unfortunately, often left to develop in the shadow of work by, again, non-trans writers, academics, and publishers. So an interesting aspect that I found was two theorists looked at one of Susan Stryker's articles from 2004 called Transgender Studies, Queer Theory's Evil Twin, which is a great title. And they wrote a response to it 15 years later. So Susan's article was kind of looking at trans studies as it was in the early 2000s, and then they wrote a response paper in 2019. And they said that transgender studies is negotiating a complex and precarious moment of partial institutionalization while still being overwhelmingly made up of underemployed, marginalized scholars and trans practitioners who face systemic barriers to entering higher education and the academy. So these issues of occupational and thus financial precarity, lack of workplace and community support, and intersection of marginalization that further bar trans people of color, especially Black and Indigenous trans feminine persons, from entering an academic institution affect the theoretical writing and educational development that I was able to access, that maybe many of us here were able to access, so it unfortunately really limits what we have access to. So poet and performer Jay Dodd, writing for Poetry magazine, notes that, quote, the world of politics is mirrored and embedded in art and most definitely in poetry, and asks, quote, what is the poetry establishment's responsibility and how do we transcend the conversation from spotlight and special issue activism? So there is no easy answer to any of these questions. It is possible that the poetics of resilience are inherent in every poem written and disseminated by a trans person. By writing a poem and sharing it, this trans poet is thus proving to the literary world that they exist. The very act of writing and potentially publishing as a trans person is indeed political, as trans bodies are often unfairly politicized as a part of an ongoing history of violence that seeks to erase their existence. So I also want to emphasize the connection to this kind of theory of poetics of resistance and resilience to the works of Audre Lorde and Dionne Brand. So Lorde, I'm sure many people have heard of her observation, poetry is not a luxury, and Dionne Brand's own claim that, quote, what poetry allows is the removal of parts of speech so that life may make sense to itself. Both of their theoretical works inform my thoughts on how poetry and the development of poetics for trans people is necessary. Lorde and Brand were both writing for Black, lesbian, colonized, and diasporic subjects. And for them, poetry cuts through and births thought. Poetry is necessary in language because it helps language become a tangible action that aids in the survival of the marginalized individual. As trans poetics are essentially intersectional, I can turn to Lorde again, who emphasizes that poetics, quote, give them strength and courage to see, to feel, to speak, and to dare. I argue that though the aims of trans poetics, Black poetics, and diasporic poetics cannot be equated, they share similar aims in working towards a poetic of language for their subjects to express themselves with and within that has hereunto been barred from them. So the last kind of theorist I want to talk about here is Oliver Moore, who I believe is still a student. But Moore was writing particularly towards trans poetics as taking on a kind of a forward-thinking political aim. So Moore himself notes that a change in attitude towards trans people occurs through altering language. And he speaks to contributions by trans writers that aid in, quote, slow incorporation of specific terms into our common language, terms that may have once been articulated only in coded, substitutive language. This aim of changing language, which informs and changes perspectives, is in agreement with the aforementioned connection I made between Dodd's questioning of spotlights and special issues and Cupper's transing of language to express a multi-bodied world. In Moore's eyes, any and all poetry by trans people is inherently political, not due to the writer's positions as trans. Rather, it is because they are actively working to integrate change into language. And this is what is the political act. So Moore uses an example from poet and performer Olakve Menon, but he extends his argument to trans poetics in general, and this is what he concludes in his work. So Moore is also interested primarily in what trans poetics can do for others, not necessarily what they can do for trans people themselves. So how non-trans people reading trans poetics can have a more empathetic understanding of trans people and their experiences, which I thought was a more unique perspective that I'd seen in my research. But again, I ran into quite a dearth of trans academics in my research. So I want to end with just another quote from, we'll end this section, then we'll get into the poetry, which is the fun part, with another quote from Carl Phillips. And where is it here? Oh yeah. Oh, sorry, not Carl Phillips. Rachel Blau Duplessis, who is she's a cisgender feminist literary scholar. But I was particularly interested in her discussion of a method in writing called writing as reading. She believes that this writing as reading process makes up much of contemporary writing, and she calls it a socio-personal reading, a reading that, quote, became a vital and earth-shattering act within one's investigative and imaginative life, quite charged with questions of access, consumption, positioning, pleasure, scrutiny, ingestion, interpretation, and agenda setting. She notes that, quote, language is the inventor of findings, rather than a tool used simply for the summary of findings. So in more plain terms, she's basically talking about how people can find themselves, find their own identities, find their own understandings of themselves through the act of writing. So in my own work, my own essay here today, this writing is as keen on inventing as it is on finding, illuminating, and elucidating. But again, poetry can do much of this work. Poetry by trans writers is actively working to aid in the remaking of broader poetics and the making of a poetic for trans people and trans people only, whatever, again, we may understand that to be. So this is just kind of going over my methodology, which you can ask me a bit more about in the Q&A. I've been reading as much as possible, literally anything I can get my hands on, listening to people's interviews, going to readings, accessing archives, as I have here, and having conversation with trans poets and writers in general on their craft. All of that, to me, is what makes up a poetic, and so I try and incorporate as much of it as possible into my research. And then, of course, I have research limitations. I'm only one person, so I can't read every single work of poetry by trans people. I don't have access to everything ever published by trans people, and I can only confidently read work translated in English or work translated into English. My French is terrible, and I currently have a limited understanding of linguistics, but that's something I'm working on to kind of understand. A lot of these theorists don't necessarily have a linguistic background, but to me, at least, they seem to know a bit more than I do, so I want to be able to get on their level there. So yeah, and again, my reasons for research, we can talk about this after. But now I want to get into the poems, which is the fun part. So the first poet I'm going to talk about is This one, Smoky Sumac. So Smoky Sumac is a member of the Tanaha Nation, a two-spirit and transgender poet and educator whose collection, You Are Enough, Love Poems for the End of the World, won an Indigenous Voices Award in 2018. Sumac's poem, Hierarchies of Grief, was published in Canadian Literature in 2016. This poem is accompanied by a statement from Sumac wherein he outlines his writing process, how after a lengthy period without writing, he began by writing short poems and haiku before moving to long-form poems. Quote, "This practice got me back into writing longer poems, most of which I would say center on my relationships, to my friends, family, nation, the natural world, current events, the stranger in the coffee shop." He ends with this statement with an important observation, stating, "In general, I guess, I wrote about how I interact with the world." So the process of how trans and two-spirit people write themselves, interacting or existing in the world, appears again and again in readings of trans writers reflecting on their own writing. In Sumac's case, this piece was about the women who have and continue to support him. He states, quote, "I am indebted to these women for teaching me how to continue in the face of such grief. Each of them was incredibly supportive of me publishing the poem as well, and I'm grateful for that because it was written with such love." Again, the idea of trans, and in Sumac's case, trans and two-spirit continuance, is given voice and presence in poems such as this one. The effort of these women in Sumac's life, as well as the effort he brings to poetry and his writing practice itself, is essential to understand, recognize, and honor when reading and otherwise engaging in his work. So that was, this longer poem is one of Sumac's works, and then that shorter one that he read out is, I believe, from his collection of poetry. So next, I'll talk about Kay Ulende Barrett, who writes, quote, "I say this seriously. Poetry has raised me when adults couldn't," which is a notion that I really enjoy. They state that, quote, "My poetic practice is directly engaged with finding home, a constant recalibration of the word. That is political work. As someone kicked out, left out, family forced out, and migrated, I have learned that poetry is both cultural and political strategy, a way to carve praxis as a cultural engagement." So Barrett writes to a trans poetic as well as a disabled poetic and notes how these modes of poetry come together, writing to what emerges from the space these poetics inhabit. Poetry, to Barrett, is a form of offering, an offering that goes beyond their circle of other poets. They want non-poets to read or hear their poems and to, quote, get it, the it being the feeling that is encaptured in those poems. So quoting Japanese-Hawaiian poet Rika Aoki, Barrett reflects on how she stated that people do not make movies out of poetry books. We don't have that level of extension. What we do have is intimacy. So this intimacy, not just with other trans people, but with a broader audience, is an integral part of many trans poetic practices. The effort and work of digging deep down into one's own experiences and presenting them on, in many cases, no more than a single page in a physical book is immense. The getting it that Barrett talks about is a reflection of the success of the work of the poet, but conversely, a reader's inability to get it does not necessarily reflect on the poet's skill. So next I want to look at a poem by Cameron Awkward Rich, which is entitled Faggot Poetics, and it was published in his collection Sympathetic Little Monster in 2016. And this one poem I ended up writing a whole essay on, but I won't go that deep right now. So this was interesting to me due to its kind of dual imagery here. If you want to take a second to read it while I talk. Awkward Rich's narrator wants to, quote, own the image of the man, but not the man himself. The man he is or might be does not align with the images of other men in his life, men who have hurt him in childhood and adulthood. Of course, there are no other bodies particularly present in this poem. It's just Awkward Rich's narrator, but we can see all these mentions of photographs of kind of like shadowy figures, of other ideas of other bodies that are really mentioned and encapsulated here. This poem is of a trans man narrating, questioning, and reflecting on his relation to presumably cis men. And I can see how the narrator calls into questions how he can empathize not only with himself and his desires, but with others. These kind of spectral images that are present in this poem of what is and what could be surround him, following him down dark hallways, a place where the boundary between static, unchanging photography and a shifting understanding of one's own reality blur. There's an intense exercise of empathy, in my opinion, portrayed in this poem through this imagining, one that I argue lies at the core of many trans poetic projects, the attempt to empathize with oneself at different points in one's own life. Canadian academic and trans poet Lucas Crawford takes a close look at Virginia Woolf's Orlando through a queer theorist's eye in order to assert that transgender experience is a question of empathy and projection. By empathizing with other bodies, he claims, the character of Orlando and transgender characters or narrators in poems in general engage in what Crawford calls a transgender act. Crawford states that this act, quote, houses the empathy required to move the human subject away from itself, to project or to feel into something that does not yet exist. Accomplishing such projections necessarily entails a queer relationship to futurity and to the past, given that one must be able to feel that one is something that doesn't yet have a referent. So again, this idea of a referent really stands out in Rich's poem in the sense that, again, he's talking about poetry, about images, about memory. There's nothing really concrete there, and yet there is something that he can see, that he can feel. The referent in this poem lies in what is unnamed, the potential for a man to be both an image and a reality at once. So the next one. So first, both of these poems are based in BC. I'll talk about Kai Cornetti's poem first. Kai's poem addresses similar concerns as Cameron Rich's in concerns to being recognized as who they are rather than who they're presumed to be, but through a more directly personal lens. So this poem is entitled Son/Daughter, and it's really small, especially that one on the bottom there, but you can read this. This one is on Poetry Magazine's online archive. It's an amazing poem. So, in particular, I was interested in the fragmented form and the spaces, and that's like pretty technical stuff for poetry, but just how well Conrad's use of spaces and really contributes to the content of the poem, like mentions of like angels and death and heaven and falling, and like you see it visually. I'm a very visual person, so to me, like I could see what this poem is about, if that makes sense. But anyways, the poem introduces a dream wherein the narrator revisits the death of his father, only to have him return not once but twice in two separate dreams that speak to the grief and subconscious emotional struggle the narrator is facing due to this loss. However, the narrator turns to a narrative in the last two stanzas, likening the moment his father said, quote, "You will always be my daughter," to prior images of falling angels and notions of separation expressed by the father. "I can't come back to earth, not ever." The narrator asks, quote, "Will I be allowed to come back to earth and be your son?" ending the poem in a state of questioning, which a lot of trans poets end their poems in a question, like a literal question. That was something that I came across in a lot of issues of transgender tapestry at the archives. There were so many questions, which you can't avoid them. So Conrad's narrator, who will presumably never receive an answer from his deceased father, is left in a kind of limbo, as we see at the end of the poem. The limbo is reflected in the question. This is carried through the poem's very structure. The line breaks, large spaces in individual lines, and indentation add to the themes of uncertainty, apprehension, and attempt at connection that are established from the start. As the scene in this poem occurs in the narrator's dream, the prosodic structure that contributes greatly to the disjointed and non-linear nature of dreams is really apparent here. The narrator's lucid question at the end, however, can be imagined as one asked upon waking. as Conradi's narrator contemplates his own death and potential return or reincarnation, the reader is asked not to answer it, but to sit in uncertainty with him, an uncertainty that, again, many trans people face in familial relationships such as these. So now I will go back to Ali's poem. So this one was, I think, part of the reason I chose it because it's my favorite in your collection. But to me, I read this as a poem that's grappling with, again, family. The narrator is talking to their mother. Remaining uncertain, but nonetheless emotionally connected to the narrator. And this is not dissimilar to Conradi's narrator's connection with the deceased father figure. So the mother in this one is central to the poem. It could not exist or elucidate on its topic, that of compassion, without her and the difficulties that she poses for the speaker. So again, the poem begins with a question, and I was really drawn to the question of language that is posed right at the beginning. The narrator, presumably speaking from the present, reflects to a time prior when there was a possibility of getting somewhere with language, when there was an ability to express in a way that seems impossible now. This before can only appear as a speculation. We don't know the narrator's birth year. We don't know when this poem is taking place. We don't know a lot of things about it. But the importance is still on this before, in how the narrator is faced with a difficulty currently due to a lack of language. And this lack speaks to a vocabulary that the narrator might use for experiences both past and present, but there's currently a difficulty in having that language and having that vocabulary. So the lack of communication here, actually perceived between the two figures in the poem, is further reinforced by this question, this asking about a lack of language. And it leaves the two figures in the poem at quite odds with each other, while, again, quite clearly remaining in the care of one another. The path they walk now is one interrupted by a lack of language, and an interruption that the speaker recognizes. This ties back to a multi-layered lack of language. Again, an absence of vocabulary necessary to explain trans experience and to aid in another's understanding of said experience. This blank, again, as Joy Layden may name it, disrupts not only the speaker's life, but the lives of all trans poets who are trying to find this language for themselves. And now that I've talked enough about her theory, well, there's never enough about her theory because it's great, but I want to look at one of Joy Layden's own poems, which is, you read it, it's not presented this way, but I wanted to be able to show it on a slide, so it's just reading from left to right here, down and across. So her own poem, again, addresses this blank, this lack of language, this lack of vocabulary. She has previously touched on how, for her personally, quote, trans poetics are ways of addressing a problem that is built into being human. That's why trans poetics are important, because articulating trans identities is to articulate being human. This was in an interview that she had. Her speaker is not truly a, quote, comfort animal as established in the poem, but this envisioning addresses her inability to articulate an identity. The language, again, simply does not exist. What language remains is that of love, extended into acts of comfort that are necessarily physical, without written or spoken word. As animals speak in gesture and through body, I argue that Layden might be figuring a world wherein the body does not need language to be comforted. It can be understood and self-soothed through internal validation, unmarred by external influences. However, Layden notes the unavoidable paradox of trans existence, of all human existence. One must also be seen to exist at all. Quote, I know the crucial cultural work that public portrayals of trans identity do, she notes. Without them, I, and many isolated trans people, might never have learned of gender transition or seen trans identity portrayed in anything other than disgusting or ridiculous. And that was from a review of her own poetry alongside another poet's, which is great. So, as in the case of this poem and of the many I am showing you today, they all offer a way of seeing trans identities as valid, real, and in many cases, positively lived and experienced. So the next poet is Juliana Huxtable, and she is also a performer and a DJ. I believe she's based in New York City currently. So many individual poems and continued poetic practices aim to make the fact of the writer's existence known. So Juliana Huxtable's poem, "There Are Certain Facts That Cannot Be Disputed," seeks to affirm the speaker's presence by asserting the fact that she can be seen in this world, as she remains a, quote, fact of existence. Huxtable's poetry again further reflects Layton's notion of a, quote, problem that is built into being human by directly stating that the fact of her existence cannot be disputed. Even if she remains unable to define herself or others by English language standards, Huxtable exists and can be seen, whether by the eye or by the camera lens, which is, there's a lot of mention again of cameras and visual in this poem here. But her existence also breaks boundaries, quote, boundaries regulated by autometry. Huxtable is aware of her presence as both a bounded and unbounded figure, someone entirely human who is not often viewed as such. Her confident "there I am," repeated throughout the poem, emphasizes that not only is she there to be seen by others, but she sees herself. She is viewing herself from the outside, affirming her own existence, regardless of who else knows she is extant or not. She does not need a camera, the gaze of another, or this poem even to exist. She sees herself, and for as long as the moment of this poem lasts, that is enough. Next, have J. Virginia Avery's work, which was published by Montreal-based press Metatron, and it was her debut collection, Number One Earth. So her work reads as a series of portraits of Earths or planets that do not exist, but exist as her narrator's own personal Earths that kind of represent different aspects or stages of her life. And they have relations to trauma, healing, and understanding, relationships between personal recovery and journeys towards new forms of understanding the self and others. So this is the very first poem in the collection here, and this is from one a little later on. By introducing us to a narrator who is departing not our planet Earth, but this Earth, her own personal world, Avery sets the tone of the poem and collection to follow. Recognizing how the past informs the present and future, Avery skillfully weaves a tapestry that resembles a map of the known galaxy, wherein her narrator travels from one Earth to another, all numbered, but her number one Earth is, quote, the Earth of her childhood, where her, quote, dead trans childhood remains kept in 14 jars of apricot jam that are to her the entire physical universe. The poems that follow are a lot of image poems that depict the Earths inside those jars that she mentions, poems that focus on memories and how the narrator is relating to those memories from the narrator's place in the present. So, did I put it up here? No, there's a section that goes, quote, I keep memory of my other Earth with me at all times. It helps me, like a small piece of bark in my pocket, to keep me the image of soil, of turning over a clod of soil with my kindest shovel. So wanting to remain grounded, the narrator imagines soil, which is again a very earthly object, of turning that soil over with the kindest shovel she can find. The idea of treating her personal Earth with kindness and enacting tenderness through the digging that must still be done is an extended metaphor for healing, for personal repair, and rebuilding after trauma has occurred. The other Earth that the narrator mentions is always a memory. It cannot be returned to, but it can aid in the healing process by serving as a reminder of what the narrator's world was like before said trauma. At the end of the book, Avery notes, quote, this book is a spell. The spell is the size of a meadow. Everyone is allowed in the meadow. This can be a place to heal. So by presenting this collection of related poems as a spell, as a place of protection itself, Avery is proclaiming its action and the act it completes, one of aiding again in healing. She dedicates it to everyone who is, was, or will be young, and again keeps the focus of her work on healing, of returning to childhood, of returning to places where one found solace in their self. And the implication is that by working through her own process of healing, by writing this spell, which is again the entire book, she can contribute to the healing of others, particularly those who are queer and trans, when they read and subsequently enter the meadow, the book, that Avery is envisioning. So next, I have Kai Chang Tom, who recently published an amazing book of essays that I have not yet finished, but I'm enjoying right now. So this is one of her older pieces. It's called Litany. In its beautiful repetitive form, this poem invokes such careful attention, practice, and literal action that the speaker will perform in order to, quote, honor the women who gave her life. Tom also makes careful and caring note of the, quote, women who came before and the, quote, women who are yet to come, alongside notions of a more personal becoming that is arguably linked to Tom's identity as a trans woman. The form of the poem is inspired in part by actual litanies, that repetition of important, necessary invocations that more often than not have religious ties, but here it takes the form of a poem. Tom's piece seeks to highlight women who have aided her speaker in becoming in the past, present, and the future, while also acknowledging her position as, quote, worshipper and worshipped and the slain, a line that speaks to her solidarity with other trans women. The poem ends with lines that turn the focus of the poem from other women to the woman speaking them, where the pronoun I is repeated in quick succession. The final two lines solidify her speaker's position as someone who's voicing her praise and sending her prayers across time and space, reaching out to all women who she must honor and acknowledge and aid in the future. Ending on the single word again, adds, of course, another repetitive note to this litany as poem. At once, it calls for continuance and presence, as well as reflects upon a static, unchanging past that one can look to for guidance, as well as honor and commit to remembering. So Tom's speaker holds all the prayers she wishes to offer to women, past and present and future, making her ultimately, again, an altar, a temple, and a driving flame, one that cannot go out, but is determined to continue for as long as possible. So thinking back briefly to Rachel Blau-Duplessis' notion of writing as reading, Tom is at once invigorating and uplifting herself through her writing process as she is enacting this process, so that the piece, when read, will also work to remind the reader of women's importance and continuance, or perhaps affirm the reader's own necessity in existing. Next, I have a poem by Gwen Benaway. So this was from one of her previous collections, entitled Passage. In this poem by Gwen Benaway, the passage of time is approached quite explicitly. Goes on, begins with, quote, the passage is infinite, but I'm not, and continues on, addressing the grief that Benaway's speaker is feeling as she moves through space. No specific space is mentioned, but no specific place need be mentioned. This poem encapsulates the feeling of existence in a space that will remain even after Benaway's speaker is gone. She notes that, quote, when I depart, cigarette butts linger, and that, quote, memory guides hands wherever she goes. The poem ends on a turn. Benaway writes, quote, yes, it's endless, the weight of grief. This country knows nothing else, but it's easy to forget along the river's arc that everything I've been is everywhere I am. The land goes on, even if I can't. So Benaway extends her personal history of presence in this poem. As part of a collection that focuses on Benaway's travel through Northern Ontario and the Great Lakes region, retracing her connections to herself, her experiences and expressions of indigeneity, her connections to her ancestors, and the bodies of water that continue to flow on the land, on a land still subject to violent colonization. Goes On is one of several poems that expresses both permanence and impermanence, reflecting and representing both a return and a departure. The traveling imagery expresses the idea of change, not only, of course, for the individual, but in the individual's mind, in ways of thinking, further reflecting, personal and shared memory, and feeling. So lastly, I just wanted to put up some quotes from poets on their poetic practice and their writing process. So returning to that practice, I would like to again address how much of the transpoetic effort and affect lives not only in the poem, but in the act of writing the poem and the effort of the person who wrote the poem. Their physical form, their body, their existence, their continuance, helped carry that poem into being. Poetry, like all art, begins and ends in the body. One body produces it, another receives it. The conversation between the body and the self, the body and another body, and the body of work are all embodied through and within each other. Similar to, again, Carl Phillips' notion of wrestling with concerns difficult to put into words, Gwen Benaway states that, quote, she thinks of writing as a practice, almost like a physical act that opens up possibilities for beauty. In this physical act, of course, lies the connection Benaway has with her own work. Though writing is not a physical entity per se, it necessitates a physical effort on behalf of both the writer and the reader. In keeping with this, again, Carl Phillips writes more broadly, speaking to all poetry. He states that, quote, let's see if I have that one up here. No, but this is another quote from Kai Ching Tong. When Carl Phillips states that, quote, the poem is essentially itself a body, comprised of various parts that work in various relation to one another, which could also be said, I know, of machines. But because poems are written by human beings, these relationships are unpredictable. A successful poem will never feel robotic or mechanized. It feels felt. So this feeling felt was an intriguing turn of phrase for me. The poem is at once already felt by the author who's writing it, and will again be felt by the reader who's reading it. That in turn kind of creates a conversation between the two efforts and the two feelings that are at play here. It's an exchange of emotion that is at once both physical and intellectual. Poems, like bodies, as Philip states, are made up of too many pieces to entirely understand all at once. Conversation is needed, practice must be had, and ultimately careful attention must be paid to a poem in order to feel and to be felt. So trans poetry is, of course, a creative and literary practice of feeling and being felt, but it is also a way of continuing, of cataloging, of caring, creating, and comforting. I find that the effort of writing and publishing poetry as a trans person myself comes from a place of wanting to provide for a younger version of me, who perhaps would have found solace in the words of myself in the present. I also write, however, with the understanding that trans existence relies on the existence of trans writing itself in many ways. In whatever form that writing may take, trans language making is a form of perseverance and preservation. So it is important to understand then how we read this work, how we frame this work, and how trans people and dedicated allies will engage with this work needs to be in keeping with the poetic processes and practices that the trans people have started themselves. Whether it is being diligently archived or taken to the streets in the form of a protest or quietly making poesis for yourself and yourself alone, trans poetics are a necessary part of many trans people's lives and livelihoods. So I encourage you to seek out the work of trans writers in the future and take the time to listen to what they have to say. Thank you.